He's incredible. And I mean, we know each other specifically because he is the teacher for our superstar blogging course, but David Farley is like writes all about food and travel for the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, BBC, Newsweek, Nat Geo, and so many other publications. He's written 2 different books. One, The Irreverent Curiosity, was actually made into a documentary for Nat Geo, and he's also taught travel writing at NYU, Columbia University, teaches for us, Nomadic Matt, like, you know, in the superstar blogging capacity. And he just started a website, tripout.online, during the coronavirus. And so I think he'll be telling us a little bit more about that. But he has just such a wide variety of experience when it comes to travel writing, and he has really sage advice. So I'm very excited for him to be here today to talk to you. And so be sure you have your like notebook and pen out, or you have your phone to take notes on, because I'm sure you'll want to take some notes and ask some questions, and I'll mute myself so David can take over now.
All right, you're muted. All right, anyway, so I'm here today to talk about, you know, everything you ever wanted to know about the life of a travel writer, but we're afraid to ask. As some of you may know who are on this call, this meeting today, when you travel for a living, you know, ordinary people who don't travel that much just find it baffling. One example I have is that I once, you know, fell asleep on the subway in New York City. It was like 2 a.m. I've lived all over the world, like Prague, Rome, San Francisco, here in New York, Berlin, and I'd never fallen asleep on the subway, ever. But this one night, I don't know what was going on. It was 2 a.m., I fell asleep, and I woke up in like deepest, darkest Brooklyn somewhere. And, you know, I got off the subway, and these were the pre-Uber days. So I just got out and I was walking, looking for like a car service or something. And I turned the corner, and there, like, you know, light beaming down from the heavens was this big lit up sign that said car service. So I went in, and before I went to talk to the guy who worked there behind the plexiglass, I noticed there was this big kind of plump guy sleeping on a bench in the office, in the lobby. He was sprawled out all over it, like his arms, his limbs were flailing everywhere, like an octopus or something. And then I went to the plexiglass and I said, "Oh, I need a car." And then the guy said, "Hey, Andre, you got a job." And I looked around, there was no one else in the lobby except for this guy sleeping. And Andre was finally roused from dreamland. And that was my driver, Andre, this Russian guy. So Andre and I got in the car, and he was driving me home. And Andre, this Russian guy, was very curious about me. You know, he wanted to know where was I from? Did I like living in New York City? What was my favorite brand of vodka? And then finally asked me, what do you do for a living? Well, how do you make your money? And I said, "Oh, I'm a food and travel writer." And he was very like baffled by it. He's like, "Travel writer?" Like he'd never put these two words together before. They were as incomprehensible to him as the words president and Trump. He was just like, what? These shouldn't go together, And then I explained to him, I said, well, I get on a plane or a bus or a train, and I go to a place, and I eat, I talk to people, I do research, and then I write about it. And then he said, like he suddenly understood. And he said, "So you write about where to find a restaurant?" And I was like, "Yeah, more or less." "Where to find a discotheque?" And I said, "Yeah." "Where to find prostitutes?" And I'm like, not exactly. So it made me realize Andre, my driver, had a very sort of Parkinson's grip on my profession, as a lot of people might. It's being a travel writer and traveling for a living is very romanticized, and it's understandably so. Travel is something we all aspire to. It's, one of our greatest expressions of freedom. And, being a travel writer is a dream job, or in Andre's case, a perfect job in which you can direct people to the nearest prostitute. But, there's a lot of people who really don't understand about what is the life of a travel writer, which is, what I'm here to talk about today. One thing you should know about me is that I guess when I think about it, I never really realized it, but I'm sort of an old school sort of travel writer. Like I'm not an influencer. I still have 4 figures of followers on Instagram. I don't really know SEO to save my life. I don't really take free things in exchange for exposure, stuff like that. You know, basically, like, I had been dedicated to going places and writing about them and doing a kind of deep dive into the place and really trying to understand that and convey that for the people who are reading my articles. So, you know, not that any of those things above are bad. I mean, I wish I knew SEO better, and, you know, I wish I had more followers on Instagram, blah, 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 like everyone else, but that's where I'm at. So, so the first thing I want to talk about the life of a travel writer is to, like, debunk some myths. Let's say 5 myths of sort of travel writing and a travel writer. The first myth is that you make a lot of money. I guess because, you know, people see your name in, like, the New York Times and travel magazines, and maybe you have a couple books out, you know, maybe you're on the radio sometimes, whatever. People think, oh, you must be, because I've seen your, like, book in a bookstore, I've seen your name, your byline in the New York Times or something, you must be, like, loaded or something. And, you know, that's not really the case. I put on my nicest shirt for you all today. Usually I'm just wearing rags and asking people for money. I'm just kidding. But no, but really, I live a very rich life in some ways, you know, I get to travel around all the time, but, like, I'm never going to get rich doing this. And, you know, that's fine, whatever. I'm totally happy with the life I have. And then the other myth is that for beginners, you know, especially for beginners, is that you get a lot of free trips. These days, I guess if you have lots of followers on, like, Instagram and you're, like, an influencer, free trips come your way a lot. But, like, when you're just starting out as a travel writer, and you haven't gotten a lot published, or, like, your blog isn't really getting lots of traffic, you're not going to get these offers for, like, press trips and stuff like that. But that will come as soon as you start to get, you know, word spreads about you, you start to get some stuff published and so on. Another myth is that you sell a story before you go on a trip. This is true once you become established, but when you're first starting out, you know, when I was first starting out, I used to pitch magazines before I'd go on a trip, and they'd be like, well, you don't really have much published, so we're not going to, like, put our faith in you that you're going to come back with a great story when you haven't really had much else published before. So the more you get published, the more editors are going to see, oh yeah, she's written this and that and that. Okay, you know, it looks like she can do a good job, and we'll like give her a budget to send her to, like, you know, Ethiopia to write this story, and we know she's going to come back with a good story. So, and then a fourth myth is that travel writing trips are vacations. I made this mistake when I was first starting out, and I thought, like, oh yeah, I could just sit here in this, like, pub with my travel companion, and sure, let's get another round of drinks, because conceivably anything that happens to me while I'm traveling could go into my story. But it turns out that's not really the case. You know, when I'm on an assignment, it can be really exhausting. I'm constantly, because, you know, once you get back on that plane, train, or bus, your story is kind of done. Like, you know, your research is done, your reporting is done, and that's it. So really, like, when I'm on an assignment, I sometimes have, like, a mini meltdown halfway through the trip. And that meltdown is that, like, I haven't done enough. You know, the worst thing that can happen is I come home and I sit down to write the story that I went there to write, and I don't really have enough material. And so this sort of meltdown is necessary for me, because then it kind of forces me to go into overdrive. And then I just start, you know, talking to people, interviewing people, doing more research, and so on. So to the point where when I finally leave after, say, like, a week, I'm like, okay, I think I've got enough material for the story. It's no problem at all. So really, when you're on an assignment, it's kind of a lot of work, but I'm not complaining. It's fun work, but it's pretty exhausting. By the end of the day, I'm back in my hotel or Airbnb or whatever, and I'm just like, oh my God, you know, I'm not going out tonight because I'm exhausted from doing all this stuff. But I'll go more into detail for that later. And the last myth of being a travel writer is that you have to go far away. You know, we all live in a place where people travel to. Some places people travel to more than others, of course. But, you know, like I live in New York City, which is, like, you know, up until March 2020 was a very popular place to visit. And, you know, every travel publication all over the world is going to run stories on New York City, you know, every year or every other year or so on. So there's always material to write about New York, about the place you live in. You know, like I write travel stories about New York for some British publications like The Guardian or National Geographic, the UK version, and other and like the Los Angeles Times, San Francisco Chronicle, stuff like that. So, or you can write about the place you live for local publications. You know, you could write about like the restaurant scene or the art scene or whatever is like your focus, you know, besides travel. You could focus on that and then write for local publications too. So now that we've, you know, dispelled these myths, you know, when I teach travel writing, like when I taught at NYU and Columbia University, and then now through Nomadic Matt's website, I always dispel these myths right away. You know, like I don't want to like scare anyone away, but it's good to like sort of do that, and then like a muscle, you know, you break it down so we can build it back up. Anyway, what's really important about the life of a travel writer and about like travel writing itself is the pre-trip research that you do. The pre-trip work is really important. You know, like I think there's also this myth that you can like, you know, these features that you read, these long form stories you read in travel magazines and in travel publications, digital or print, is that the writer just went there and these things just randomly, magically happened that are in the story, and then the writer wrote them down and that was it. But to write one of these long form stories, there's so much work that goes into the story. It's incredible, you know, like in a weird way, you kind of like, as a writer, you kind of gotta, I don't want to say manufacture the experience, but you got to kind of set it up so that you can have these experiences that are worth sort of writing about. You know, like there's sort of what I call the dangers of parachuting. Because locals often say, like, let's say you're going to on an assignment to say like Saigon, and what I do is, you know, I'm contacting locals and stuff like that. Sometimes I reach out to like local bloggers and writers and stuff, and they sort of hate it when I show up because they say I'm just parachuting in and I don't know anything about the place like they do. They have this local knowledge, which is true. So what I try to do is learn enough about the place so it doesn't really feel like I'm just parachuting in, you know? When you write when you go do a deep dive into a place to write about it, you got to really like do some like serious research about it. So I spend a lot of time reading about the place, doing hours of research, you know, like reading books, reading other travel articles, even doing, you know, reading academic articles about a place. You know, before I went to, a magazine was once crazy enough to send me to Belarus, to Minsk, which is a fascinating place, but like other travel magazines, it wasn't like, Minsk wasn't really like cool or sexy enough to dedicate a 10-page feature to, but a travel magazine did, you know. Before I went, I did so much research on the place. I even read like 100-word academic article called The National Identity of Belarus or something like that. But it was amazing. By the time I stepped off the plane, my first time in Minsk, the capital, I felt like I knew so much about Belarus that I ended up, well, that academic article didn't play into my article directly that I wrote. Behind all the words, you know, that article was omnipresent. And so like, for example, just doing all of that research was so important. And also sometimes the unpredictable happens, which is great. That's why we love travel, right? And it's good that you do over research about a place because you never know what's going to happen. On my very first assignment, the first time a magazine ever sent me anywhere, it was to Berlin. And so I was writing about architecture in Berlin. And what happened was when I got there, because like at the time, this is like 20 years ago, maybe, the editor-in-chief said, you know, I pitched a story about architecture in Prague because I had a good friend who's an architect there and he could help me out. He'd be like my guide. And then the editor-in-chief said, well, what about Berlin? You know, Berlin, there's a lot of interesting stuff going on there because Berlin, 10 years ago, Berlin became the new capital of this reunited Germany, and they had to build all kinds of embassies and new buildings, office buildings, apartment buildings and stuff. And Germany was very rich, and they had all this money to hire the world's best architects to build all these new buildings. But they didn't want a bunch of extravagant, like, you know, Frank Gehry like crazy buildings. So they put really strict rules onto the buildings. Like they had to be like, you know, they had to look like a regular building and not like some kind of like, you know, like circus or something. So when I got to Berlin and I was like going around looking at all these buildings by famous architects, including Frank Gehry, I realized, you know what, this is kind of a boring story. There's like, so what? Like the Frank Gehry building is a bank. And on the outside, it looks interesting, but on the inside, it looks amazing, but you can't really walk into the bank. And I'm like, I can't really write this story about telling people to go to like a corporate headquarters where there's a Renzo piano building, or like a department store, you know, where there's another famous architect building by an architect, this bank, blah, blah. And I had this, you know, the crisis that I talked about earlier. And I was going to interview an architect there, a British guy. And I kind of laid it flat out to him. I said, I don't know if this story is going to work, man. He's like, why? I explained to him. He said, you're right. But he said, there's something very interesting about this story that you're not getting. He said, because the new capital of Germany is Berlin, and they built all of these office buildings and apartment buildings, assuming that all these people, all these corporations are going to move to Berlin from other parts of Germany, and their employees are going to move there. He said that didn't happen. And so as a result, there's a huge supply of space, of offices and apartment buildings, but there's no demand. So that's why apartment rents and storefront rents are super cheap in Berlin right now. They were, this is 20 years ago. And he said, as a result, like you can rent out a shop space for like 200 euros a month. And so if you've ever had this dream of opening up like a cool record store or a boutique or a bar or whatever, you can kind of do it in Berlin. And that's why the like shopping scene and the nightlife scene and the restaurant scene in Berlin is so cool and cutting edge right now, because anybody can just do it. And because I had over-researched Berlin for this story, you know, I went beyond architecture. I did do research on the Berlin like restaurant scene, the nightlife scene, the shopping scene, and blah, blah. I walked away from that meeting realizing I had a new angle for my story. And I knew exactly where to go. I knew the neighborhoods to go to. I knew like the restaurants, the bars, the clubs, the pubs to go to, because I had done all this research already. I got nervous and I over-researched. So because I came to this crisis and because I over-researched, I was just like, boom, I pivoted. And I wrote like, you know, what was like a story I was very proud of. And it was only because, well, this architect tipped me off, but also because I just done all this research. So, you know, that it was great that happened to me on my very first big assignment, because it really taught me a big lesson is, you know, the key is to write about places that you're fascinated with, that you really kind of have a passion about. And that will drive you to do a bunch of reading about the place and so on. And then the other thing I do that's really helpful, and it makes the trip even better, is to try to connect with local people as much as possible. You know, friends of friends. I put word out on Facebook and Twitter, who knows someone in here, or blah, blah, blah. Or inevitably at this point now, I know people who know people in places. So like in February, I was in Hanoi, and or I was going to Hanoi, and I needed to make some local connections. So I know some people who know people in Hanoi. So I said, hey, I'm going to Hanoi to write this article about blah, blah, blah. You know, do you know anyone I should meet up with? And they're like, yeah, I know a couple of people. So, you know, within a couple of days, I was emailing with like 5 people in Hanoi. And they were really, really instrumental in helping me connect with the type of people I needed to write the story. And, you know, like in Hanoi, I had like an entourage of like local people, like expats and Vietnamese born people. And like when we went out, I had like 5 people with me the whole time, local people who lived there, who were like taking me around. Oh, you got to meet this guy. You got to meet this woman. This person is really helpful for you. And I would have never really been able to do that on my own. So not only does it help you for your story, but like, you know, it enriches your experience much more. That happened in Belarus too. Like the editor for the magazine who sent me there said, well, you know, we like our writers to be really immersed in the place because we think that like that'll give you a better story to write about. So do you know anyone in Minsk? And I was like, no, but I was like, give me 2 weeks and I'll have people. So he's like, all right. Within 2 weeks, I had people like picking me up at the airport in Minsk. And still to this day, that was like 10 years ago. You know, those people are friends. And, you know, I've been in touch with them recently because there's all this like political unrest happening in Belarus, and I'm checking in with them and getting their take on it, you know. And so like these relationships are not only relationships that last for your trip, they're relationships that last a lifetime. And now, you know, I can go back there and these people will be helpful and help, you know, in crafting whatever next story I'm going to write about. So, you know, so that brings up, you know, when you're in the place, you know, in order to tell a good story, you also have to travel in a way that helps create a good story. So, you know, that's really important. That's what I think about when I'm traveling. You know, people often ask me, like, does being a travel writer, does it ruin travel for you? And it actually doesn't at all. In fact, what I always tell people is that it actually makes travel richer for me, because, you know, I have to have these experiences that are interesting and that somehow exemplify the place, and also makes for fun reading. So like, you know, I end up in like some stranger's car going God knows where, you know, some friend of a friend, or I'm suddenly find myself back in the kitchen talking to the chef of a restaurant, or, you know, whatever. And, you know, it really makes for the travel experience really great. And one kind of policy I have is I try to say yes to almost every offer I get. You know, of course, unless it feels sort of dangerous or whatever, or illegal. But like one time I was in, so a magazine sent me to La Paz, Bolivia, and they had this story, they had this like type of story in every issue where they would send a writer, they'd pick a writer, and they would send you to a place with only 24 hours notice. And so I was very honored that they asked me to do this. And so I got an email and they said, okay, you're going to La Paz, Bolivia tomorrow. And so for 5 days. And so this was really hard, because this goes against everything I've been talking to you about the last 20 minutes, which is like do research, make local connections and stuff. I had 24 hours, and then I had 5 days to like find a story, you know. This is kind of like travel writing practice or something, because it was like, oh my God, I'm going to land in La Paz, Bolivia, and I'm not really going to know anyone. And I have 5 days to just figure something out and come back and get back on the plane. And I better have like a good story to write about that's going to go in this like print travel magazine. And so this is where saying yes to everything comes in handy. So there was like some kind of street fair going on in La Paz. And there were these like ladies sitting like on the sidewalk in like lawn chairs, and they had umbrellas and stuff, and they were drinking beer. And they called me over. They're like, hola, hey, come here, come here. And again, it was where I'm like, okay, say yes. Don't say, no, I'm not gonna go over there. That seems weird. So I ended up spending like a couple hours with these Bolivian women. And, you know, I didn't speak Spanish very well, and they didn't speak English very well. But, you know, that became the meat of this story that I wrote about. In fact, it became the story. Like this 2 hours was the story. I spent the next like 4 days wandering around Bolivia, wondering if maybe something else might pop up. But when it came to it, is this experience I had drinking beer with these women. And eventually like some shaman showed up, and he was like blessing me, and he had a very dire prediction about my life. And, you know, it became this really, really interesting story. And if I had not, you know, said yes to these women calling me over to like drink some beer with them on the street, then I would have never written this really, first of all, I would have never had this really amazing experience. And I would have never written this really amazing story. So it's worth, you know, with caution, saying yes to most offers that come your way when you're traveling. You know, and that brings up another point, which is like, I guess one interesting thing I try to do is to sort of challenge myself to get out of my comfort zone when I'm traveling. You know, there's this quote I like by George Bernard Shaw where he said, I dislike feeling at home when I'm abroad. And so getting out of your comfort zone is kind of important. I mean, it has to sort of happen organically. You can't just wake up one morning when you're traveling and be like, I think I'm going to get out of my comfort zone today. It's just sort of like, you know, joining this like beer drinking meeting with the Bolivian women, for some people might have been out of our comfort zone. You know, it's one of those things where you're just like, okay, I got to just do this. And I can always, if I start to get uncomfortable, you know, beyond my control, I can always just walk away, you know. You know, in this sort of age of globalization, I find being a traveler and being a travel writer becomes more challenging because, like, you know, when you're in the center of almost any city now, you just see the same stuff. You know, you see like Starbucks and H&M and Uniqlo and, you know, all these like sort of same businesses almost anywhere you are in the world. And so um, that sort of, I don't know, it's sort of, in a way, it's like when I land in a city and I see all that stuff, it makes it kind of dull to me. It's like, yeah, I've seen all these places. So I feel like I have to try harder to sort of get away from that, you know, which means, you know, that's just like an extra challenge for me. Um, so, and one thing I like to do is when I go somewhere on an assignment, like my sort of classic example is about, I don't know, 10 years ago, I went to Vietnam for the first time. And my story was that there was a New York chef, a Vietnamese born New York chef who I kind of got to know a little bit. And I said to him, if I got like a big assignment with like a high circulation publication on going back to Saigon with you and eating our way through Saigon, would you be willing to get yourself to Saigon for the assignment? He was like, yeah, because for him, that's like amazing publicity. So I got this assignment with the New York Times and I went there and we did the story and it turned out okay, you know, it was fine. But what I did is I took like an extra week to go travel around Vietnam. And while I was in Hoi An, in Hoi An, I came upon another story. And I was like, wow, this is great. But I didn't have enough time to really like dig into that story. So when I came home, I pitched that story to a magazine. And then they were like, yeah, this is great. And so 6 months later, I was back in Vietnam writing that story and did that. And I did the same thing as before. I, you know, took a little time and traveled a bit, just like kind of like a vacation, kind of like a reconnaissance mission, just sort of wander around and see if any other stories kind of pop up, you know? And sure enough, right in Hoi An, something did. I found this school, a culinary school and restaurant in Hoi An called Streets International. And they train orphans and underprivileged children in Vietnam in the culinary arts. And then they find them a job at like the resorts that have popped up along the central coast of Vietnam. And I was like, that's a great story. So I went home, pitched it, you know, eventually like a year later, I was back in Hoi An writing the story. And I also had a second story. I was going for BBC Travel. I was writing about the banh mi sandwich, and that story took me to Hanoi. And so while I was in Hanoi doing research on the banh mi sandwich, I came upon another story idea, which was about pho, you know, or pho, the sort of national dish of Vietnam. And I was hanging out with the chef as we were kind of eating banh mi sandwiches. And I had this kind of weird question I never thought of, which was, where does pho come from? I said, you know, I thought this dish is all over Vietnam, from the top to the bottom. Pho is everywhere. And it's in every Vietnamese restaurant all over the world. And he's like, you know, actually pho comes from either Hanoi or a region near Hanoi from some small village. And I'm like, wow, that's fascinating. You know, the origins of pho. So when I went home, you know, you can guess what I did. I pitched it. Nobody really went for it for a while. It took a couple of years, but eventually I got the New York Times to agree to it. And that's why I was back in Vietnam in February doing this story. So, you know, taking a little extra time on your trip to just kind of wander around and like soak in the atmosphere, ask questions, hang out with locals, can lead to like more and more assignments, you know? So, so that's kind of part of my life, is sort of just wandering around and taking in the atmosphere and hoping, you know, I'll come upon another idea for a story and then I'll be back in that place. You know, another example of something that really helps is kind of returning to a place again and again. For some people, that's kind of boring, you know, like, you know, we've got your country counters, you know, people who like always have that number and they're like, I've been to 78 countries now. You know, I don't really pay any attention to that. Instead, you know, sure, if I can go to a new country, I love that. But I like returning to places that I know well too, because then I get a deeper knowledge of the place. And so I happen to have a lot of friends in Dubrovnik, you know, on the Dalmatian coast in Croatia. And I was returning to there again and again and again. I had like a whole group of friends there. And, you know, what's beneficial about that is that someone would just say something to me like, you know, like randomly. I'm like, oh yeah, you know, in the next town, they make this one dish there and it's only made there and it's really amazing and blah, blah, blah. You know, I'm just making that up, but someone will just say that to me, like, you know, on a whim. And I'm like, oh, what, well, tell me more. And they're like, well, you know, it's like supposedly has these strange origins and blah, blah, blah. And, you know, you can't get it anywhere else. And suddenly the next day I'm in that village and I'm kind of exploring that. And I'm like, okay, this is a great story. So like the more time I spent in like certain places and have like groups of friends there who are like locals, the more time someone will just say something and I'm like, oh, that's really interesting, you know? And I never, you know, sitting in my like in my laptop in New York doing research, I never would have come across some of this stuff unless I'm just kind of there hanging out and talking to people and making friends with people and so on. So I know that's easier said than done by saying, oh, have kind of like a random sort of second home somewhere so you have like a deeper knowledge of the place. But if you can do it, there's some way you can actually do that. I highly recommend it. And then there's after the trip. And you know, after the trip is when you sit down, you got to craft some kind of interesting, very publishable, very readable story about the place. And that really all depends on what you did during the trip and how much notes you took, how many people you interviewed. You know, the worst thing is when I sit down to write a story and I'm going through my notebook and I'm like, you know what? I don't really have, nobody really said anything that interesting to me. And, you know, it's not their fault. It's my fault for not like pulling that out of them, for not asking the right questions. And, you know, I get really upset with myself. And that's happened a couple of times. And while the stories did get published, you know, they weren't really the best things I've ever written, because I don't know, I just, you know, you can't hit a home run every time. And, you know, I didn't do my job as well as I wanted to, I guess. I don't really know. So, you know, you're writing up the story, you send it in, you get your edits back, you know, you always get your edits back. When I first started out this and I got the editor sent me back the story with all kinds of, you know, in track changes, all these markups and stuff, I was like kind of devastated. I was like, oh my God, I failed at this. I'm a terrible writer. Why am I even doing this? But now I've been doing this 20 years and I realize that's kind of part of the process. And some editors mark up your story more heavily than others, you know? So just, you got to have thick skin and you can't take it personally, you know, it's part of the game. You know, and then there's like invoicing, which is like chasing down your money and making sure you get paid. There's finding new story ideas, you know, that's how you keep going in this business, is finding new story ideas. So unfortunately, there isn't really like a formula to doing that. If there was, we'd all be like, you know, on the road making a go at this, you know, but that's the hard part. Pitching stories, knowing which publications, what type of stories they publish. So you have to like know the market so well that when you come up with an idea for a story, you should know sort of just like that, what publication it's best for and what publications it's not best for. An editor once told me that like 85% of the stories, the pitches he says no to are because they're not right for that publication. So, you know, the better you know the market out there and what publications publish what type of stories, the more success you'll have for doing this. And then it's, you know, doing it all over again. So you just got to kind of keep up that cycle. I feel like when I'm really doing this well is when there's a sort of cycle going on, which is that like, I have a bunch of stories out there in this sort of cycle and they're all in different sort of phases, you know, like pitching, planning a trip because I have an assignment, you know, doing research, get edits back for another story. The story is just going to be published, you know, like this whole cycle. And when I have a bunch of stories in this whole loop, I'm like, okay, I'm totally making this happen. Of course, sometimes that cycle ends and then you get really nervous and you start to see your like, you know, bank account sort of dry up and you get nervous and you're like, oh my God, I got to pitch story. So anyway, in conclusion, I just want to say that I once had a story, an assignment to write a profile on the American film director, John Waters. And he had just written a book about hitchhiking. So in the profile, my editor said, this is for The Guardian, she said, why don't you go hitchhiking with John Waters? I'm like, why not? You know, how often does that happen? So I went down to Baltimore and, you know, we were hitchhiking outside of his house in Baltimore and we got picked up right away, of course. And I got in the back seat, he got in the front seat. And, you know, John Waters kind of, when we got in the car, he sort of turned around and kind of nodded at me and smiled, you know, as if to say, see, isn't this fun? And then he said something that I thought was really interesting. And I quote from him a lot on this because I think it's so great. He said, you know, I think it's dangerous to stay at home, never going out and seeing the world and meeting new and interesting people, now that's dangerous. And, you know, I couldn't agree more. Despite the fact that we're in the middle of a pandemic, we probably should be staying home right now. But in any other time in life, you know, staying home and never meeting people and seeing the world can be very dangerous on our minds. So, so I keep that as kind of my motto. Anyway, I kept this kind of a little bit vague because I figured some of you are going to have some very specific questions. So ask away, and I'm happy to answer anything you want.
Amazing, David. I felt like that was such a good like podcast version of a presentation, and it was great. Leah came up with that term, by the way, not me. But we do have a few questions, but I just want to say that last quote hit me straight to the soul. I think I recognized like 3 weeks ago that what really is killing me during the pandemic is the fact that I can't meet strangers, and I adore meeting strangers. It's my favorite thing in the whole world, which is why I love traveling so much. And so, that quote, and I'm a big hitchhiker, so I get it.
You are?
I am. I've hitchhiked.
Wow.
I started hitchhiking in Zambia, and then I hitchhiked all over St. Vincent and the Grenadines, Iceland. Those are the only 3 countries, but all over. Really fun and safe. We did it very safely. Anyway, we do have a few questions, and I know that you have sort of a time limit because you're going away, and so we'll do this rapid fire. Emily wanted to know, how did you get started, and how much do you, did you do much unpaid work to build up your published content?
I did. Good question. I think 1 or 2 stories I had sent out to travel websites that didn't really pay anything, just to get established. But what really helped was that, and you know, this is still the case. There are fewer like newspaper travel sections that are taking freelance as opposed to 20 years ago. But the one thing that's really important is that, like, at least for American newspapers, when you're just starting out, if you haven't written for them before, what most of the travel editors want is they don't want you to pitch them a story. They'd rather you just write a story on your own and then send it in. And that's kind of great if you're just starting out, because if you're pitching a story, you don't have anything previously published, they might say, well, you know, this is a good pitch, but like, it'd be great to see some of your other published writing so you can show me that you can write. But if you write the story up and send it to the editor, they've got the story right there. So they can publish it if they want. They don't need any other proof that you can write. They like the story, it's there. So that's kind of the de facto way of getting published in newspaper travel sections. And so what I did, because I didn't have very many things published, is I just wrote up stories and polished them and had friends read them and give me feedback until I felt like it was ready. And I just send out stories to newspaper travel editors. And the first story that got published was in the Chicago Tribune. And the editor loved it. And then after that, he liked my writing, and then I could pitch him stories. And I did that for like a few newspaper travel sections. I just send out a story, and if they liked it, they would publish it. So right away I had, like, you know, I went from having almost nothing published to having, you know, a story published in the Chicago Tribune and then the Washington Post and so on. And, you know, I was like a beginner. So I think that policy is really helpful for people who are just starting out.
Awesome. And that was Kira's question also. So we sort of cleared that away. And then Phil was asking, once you've begun to establish credibility through articles and posts, how do you then best pitch articles and ideas to magazines, newspapers, websites, etc.?
Right. You know, figure out who you want to write for. And, you know, the key is getting your pitch into an editor's inbox, the right person's inbox. You know, like a lot of magazines just have like send your story pitches to info@condenasttraveler.com or whatever. You know, an intern reads those and just hits like, you know, reject. And you got to like find out like who's there, you know, like say Condé Nast, for example, the whole Condé Nast magazine empire, they have like an email formula, which is, I think it's first name _ last name @condenast.com. And so what you do is then go to the masthead of the magazine where it says who works there, and pick out an editor's name. Let's say it's, you know, Erica Vervo, and you just, you know, Erica _ you know, @Condé Nast, and then you get your pitch right in her inbox for her eyes to look at, and to decide if she wants your story or not. So
Mhm.
I think that's a really important way of doing it. For a lot of magazines though, unless you're like a prolifically published writer already, if you haven't written for them, they want you to start out writing the shorter things like that come at like the front of the magazine, the 300 word stories, the 500 word stories. They're rarely going to assign you a huge feature right away. You have to like kind of work your way through the magazine from the front to the middle to the back where the features are. So, I'd say if you're just starting out, you have a few things published, you haven't written for that particular magazine before, set your eyes on the front of the magazine first, and then have your goal is to work your way through it to the back.
That's awesome. Great advice. We have somebody with a Israeli name that I do not know how to read, who's asking, how do you think travel writing opportunities, like getting assignments and actual opportunities during a trip, differ between male and female writers?
I don't. I would have said that 10 years ago, travel writing was really male dominated. Actually, I mean, there's this great collection of the great anthology that comes out every year called Best American Travel Writing. I highly recommend it to just get a sense of what's considered, the best American travel writing. But the stories are really great, and the writing is always superb. There was one year about 6 or 7 years ago when these are stories that are plucked from magazines that were published the previous year. And one year, about 6 or 7 years ago, there were 20 stories that were published in this anthology, and they were all men. And people were, rightfully so, they were enraged. Like, what the hell? Like, are there not female travel writers? And of course there are. For whatever reason, like the editors of the book didn't choose any women. And, as we all know, that's changed a lot. So I think there's a lot more opportunities for female travel writers now, and there's a lot more visibility for female travel writers now than there's ever been. So things are, and people of color too who are travel writers, there's a lot more visibility for them now than there's ever been. So I think everything's moving in the right direction, and I think that's great. We should all be really happy with that.
For sure. Also, on the last note where you were saying info at doesn't really get to anyone, if anyone wants to write for our community blog, info at thenomadicnetwork.com comes straight to my inbox and I read them. There's no intern reading them. So if you wanted to be published on a website that's not your own, or you don't have a website, definitely contact me, because we love sharing people's stories from the community, and so we'd love to see them. And then we have a question from Kirsten that says, how do you log your notes and photographs during the trip?
Right, good question. I take notes in a notebook, just like old school. When I'm doing an interview where I want to make sure I get every word that's somehow I deem some interviews important, worth recording, then I'll record it on my phone. The thing is, I hate transcribing interviews. At the same time, my handwriting, my penmanship has gotten so bad that sometimes when I'm going through my notes, I can't really read what I wrote down. I'm like, I know this woman said some really amazing things, but oh my God, I can't read what I wrote down. So I'm always kind of tied between recording interviews and then writing them down. Photos, a lot of my stories, I'm not really responsible for the photos. So I take photos with my iPhone. Sometimes if I'm writing for a big magazine, they've got the budget to hire a professional photographer. So I don't have to really worry about that. I take photographs all the time just to like jog my memory of places. When I get home, I'm like, oh yeah, what did that look like exactly? I'm like, oh, I've got a photo of that like building or whatever. So I do that. But yeah, like even, for newspapers, except for the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, they usually want the writer's photographs. And, I'd say the last few years, I'm just taking photos with my iPhone and getting them published in like, the Wall Street Journal and the San Francisco Chronicle and stuff. They're all just my iPhone photos. They're not the best photos. I'm not like a trained photographer or anything, but I know enough about travel photography that I'm able to take photos that are at least publishable. They're not going to win any awards, but oh well.
Right. Totally got that. And iPhones are good for that these days. Emily is asking, how much attention do you have to pay to SEO optimization, keywords, and all that sort of stuff? And have you learned to do this very well, or is that something that's done by someone afterward?
Right. I don't pay any attention to that at all because I let the magazines, I let my editors deal with the SEO stuff. I have my own website, and so now I'm just kind of realizing, oh, maybe I should, SEO these stories somehow. Um, SEO is kind of the enemy of good writing, because SEO kind of breaks the, because there are these rules for good writing and there's these rules for SEO and they're kind of contradictory. For example, repeating keywords and phrases. Any writing teacher will tell you, don't repeat these keywords and phrases so close to each other. That's not a sign of good, strong writing. But I know for SEO, you have to do that. So it's kind of this battle, I think what editors do is they change the headlines of stories online as opposed to in print for SEO reasons. And so they do that, but they don't really alter my stories very much for SEO purposes. So
Cool.
SEO questions are more for Nomadic Matt than they are for me, I think.
Oh yes, he's an SEO genius. If
Yeah.
you want to know anything about SEO, go to Nomadic Matt. Um, Phil is asking, is there a preferred length to a story?
What does that mean?
I guess there's a different length for every different kind of story. Maybe that's the answer.
Like an actual link, like a web link,
Length,
or
length.
length. Sorry.
Yeah.
That depends. That all depends on the publication. Like the New York Times, for example, runs stories between 1,500 and 2,000 words. Like the big glossy travel magazines like Condé Nast Traveler and Afar and stuff. They're more like between 2,000 and 3,000 words. Lengths are being truncated. Like as our attention spans shorten, so our stories becoming shorter. So I would say shoot for like 1,500 words is kind of the perfect length, I would say.
Okay, cool. And then Susan is asking, is the writer's market still a viable way to find new publications to pitch?
Writer's Market, the book, I suppose. I would never use Writer's Market because Writer's Market, it's a book that comes out every year where they have all these publications, and they give you the email address of editors and stuff like that. Because this sounds really snobby, but this is the point of view of the editor. Because that book is so readily available to the general public, they fear that some newbie, some person who just woke up one day and decided I want to be a writer is going to send them all these stories, that they've written, and they're going to clog up their inbox with all these stories that they don't want. So they try to avoid that and they just put the info at, condenast.com sort of email address in there. And they rarely put their actual email address in there, at least for the big travel magazines. And so what the deal is they think if you can find my actual email address, then you're serious enough about doing this that I'll take you seriously. But they don't really take people seriously who come from the Writer's Market book. So I would say, I don't know, avoid using Writer's Market and just sort of find your own way. What I do is I Google, let's say I want to find the travel editor of the Los Angeles Times. I'll Google Los Angeles Times in quotes and travel editor in quotes. And there'll be a link somewhere. I'll be like, the travel editor of the Los Angeles Times is blah, blah, blah. So then I'll Google that person's name and say the word email or something, or at latimes.com. And eventually I'll see somewhere online is that person's email address. And then I found their email address within a minute. Sometimes students of mine, in the Nomadic Matt writing class, they'll ask me, do you know who is the editor for this? And I'll be like, give me 60 seconds. And literally within 60 seconds, I'm like, here you go. So it's pretty easy to find anyone's email address.
Do you also use Twitter for that or no?
No, rarely. The travel editor at New York Magazine was so bad at responding to people that I eventually DM'd her, and I pitched. She's like, "Yeah, send me your pitch on DM on Twitter." So I actually pitched her on Twitter, and she was like, "Yeah, great, go for it, write the story." And it was really weird and unorthodox, but rarely. Only if they initiate it. But yeah, sure, you could DM an editor and say, "Hey, I have a story for you. Would you mind giving me your email address, so and usually they'll respond.
Okay, cool. I just also put the link to the writing class that you teach in the chat. So if anyone wants
Thanks.
to join, go ahead. Also, we have a question. I'm going to end it on this. We skipped like 3 questions. So if you have questions for David that we didn't get to, I'm sure he'll answer if you write to him on Twitter or on his website.
Yeah, or you can email me. My
What?
email is david.farley@gmail. Pretty easy to remember. Just remember my name, david.farley@gmail. And, email me. I'm happy to answer any questions. I get random questions from people that I don't know all the time.
Yeah.
Asking me about travel writing, and I'm always happy to respond.
I mean, you are a teacher, so
Right.
I feel like it's in your blood. So we have a question from 2 people. This question came up that's like, one of them just decided to be a travel writer and it's the pandemic, and the other one is asking like, how has it changed? How has travel writing changed since the pandemic? So can you speak to that?
Yeah, travel right now, as you probably noticed, most travel stories that are being published are all sort of pandemic related, about should we travel, how should we travel, and just stuff related to that. And it's going to be like that for a little while longer. I think that the travel industry and the travel writing publishing industry is going to bounce back, but it's not going to be overnight. It's going to take a while. So I'm just kind of sitting tight. I'm not really like, that's why my quarantine project was starting this website, tripout.online, because I had a bunch of stories kind of rotting on my hard drive that were published, but the publication folded, or I wrote it and I forgot about it and it had never been published. So, I was just like, all right, I'm just going to start my own publication for now and not make any money off it, but it's going to give me something to do. And now that it's done, I'm like, now what do I do with this thing? But yeah, I'm just kind of sitting tight and, reading a lot, I'm writing some essays and trying to improve my own writing and my own knowledge about places, so that when this industry kind of bounces back, I'll be in a position to like pitch some stories and write some stories and stuff like that. So I don't know. I don't know if this is sage advice or not, but I'm just kind of trying to adjust to this new world, and I know that it's not going to be like this forever, because everything's always changing and everything's impermanent. So so there's all these stories about people talking about what's the future of travel going to be like? What's the future of this? We don't know. And I try not to read those articles, because I think that we just don't know. And this old world that we remember, it's not going to be the same, but it's going to come back. There's going to be some semblance of that too. Mm-hmm. And, we'll all be traveling again within a couple of years, I hope. Things will be somewhat back to normal, I hope. And then, then we can all be travel writing.
Yeah, I think that's great advice, to brush up on everything. I always, we get a lot of questions about, I'm about to start my big trip, and so I'm going to start a blog while I'm there. And I'm like, don't do it. Start the blog before your big trip. Learn everything about the blog, and then enjoy your trip, and then write about it after. So it's really good advice to like brush up on everything now, so that when, people are actually up for jobs again, you'll be ready. That's awesome. Okay, so I'm just gonna share my screen again for 2 more minutes and close out just by saying, well, we have lots of these. Thank you, David. That was incredible.
Oh, no, thank you. And thanks to everyone who tuned in. I love doing these things, and this was really a lot of fun for me.
Oh, it's really great. We had a ton of people on too, and so many great questions. So thank you. And we love bringing these events to you. At thenomadicnetwork.com/events, you'll find all of our events that are coming up. I just wanted to highlight the next few. Next Tuesday, we have Paige from Paige Media that's going to teach all about camera confidence. She's a star at this sort of stuff. So if you ever want to do videos, please come to that. It's going to be awesome. And then on Thursday, we have Joe, who's coming to teach about, or to share about this product that has kids connecting all over the world through VA, pen pals, tech, and all this sort of stuff. And it's just like, when I heard about it, I was like, please, please, please come to our community and share about this, because I really believe that our community is so interested in the next generation being globally minded. And this seems like a very great tool to get it there. And so I just wanted him to share about this with our community. Then we have on September 8th, Stephanie, who's here today, who's going to do building self-confidence through solo travel. Very excited about that. And then we have Bailey on September 9th, who's going to come and talk about how to travel from home when the pandemic cancels your plan. She was supposed to be at the Mongol rally, which is like a 6 or 8 week ordeal, and that got canceled, and she's done the whole thing virtually, literally. So she's very creative. And then we have Nicole Brewer, who's been in Oman for I believe it's 6 or 7 years teaching English, and she travels the world, and she has a blog and all this stuff. And so she's going to be calling in from Oman, which is a place that we hear very little about, but she seems to be living the life there. So I wanted to bring her on to share about that. And so all these are free events. We're very excited about them. Having said that, we are definitely a travel company in the middle of a pandemic. So if you have the means and would like to support us, these are 2 different ways you could do that. We have our Patreon, which is for the Nomadic Mat team, and you get a ton of different things for your different level of membership. The lowest level of membership is $3 a month, and it really does help us, and you get some really cool stuff as you move up, like tickets to TravelCon, which is pretty cool. But if that's something that, you know, seems a little daunting to you because it's a monthly membership, that you can cancel at any time. We also have a one-time donation button, and we have these on all of our invitations, so you can find it very easily on our website. Last but not least, thank you for being a part of our community. This was amazing. These events are just so fun for me and worthwhile, and I get to learn so much. And I feel like from all the feedback, you know, that's also what you guys are thinking too. So I just really want to say thank you for being a part of our travel community, because without you, we wouldn't have any of these events. And, you know, without people like David, we wouldn't have these very interesting talks on different topics that, you know, we don't necessarily have access to otherwise. So thank you so much, David, again.
Thank you.
And like I said, David did this out of the kindness of his heart. So feel free to follow him on Twitter, Instagram, connect with him. If you become a travel writer after this talk, tell him that he inspired you. You know, share with him. And I just wanted to say thank you, and have a wonderful day, weekend, and I'll see you next week. All right, bye everyone.
Bye.